Hello you guys, welcome back to my channel. I am so excited for today's video. I've had this on my list to like put together and film for a little bit now, and I finally sat down to gather the correct information, and today I'm going to be sharing with you the 15 most neglected eyeshadow palettes in my current collection. All of the palettes that I'm sharing with you guys today I have owned for at least 4 years, some of these more than 4 years, and every single eyeshadow palette that I'm sharing with you today I have used less than 10 times in the last 5 years is kind of the like data I had to go off of. So we've got some very underutilized palettes to chit chat about today. I love eyeshadow palettes. I do have a pretty large eyeshadow palette collection, but it does make me so sad to see all of these neglected eyeshadow palettes scattered about my collection. So if you're interested in what palettes have really not gotten any love, like they're constantly getting the swipe left, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project planning content, palette themed content, or just chit chatting about makeup, I'd love if you'd consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. Okay, it's like 90 out and I still need to go for my walk later, and I thought about straightening my hair. It was in a ponytail earlier, like a kind of like a messy ponytail. So it's looking a little questionable. I definitely need a cut. Like my ends are so dry, but I didn't feel like straightening it and I wanted to wear it down. So anyway, that's where we're at. I'm gonna start with like the ones that of these 15, the ones that have been used the most, and then we'll end with the least used eyeshadow palette in my collection. Okay, so we can start with, there are 4 of the 15 eyeshadow palettes I'm sharing today I've used 9 times. So up first I have the Natasha Denona Zendo eyeshadow palette, and mine definitely, the layout of this is not the original Zendo right now. I do like to kind of create my own custom Natasha Denona midi palettes because they're magnetic pans that you can remove. But the Zendo eyeshadow palette, I was most excited of all of the Natasha Denona launches, with the exception of I Need a Nude and the Midi Gold, or the newest one that she launched. I think I was most excited about the Zendo launch. In fact, I'll post a picture of Zendo over here so we can see what the like actual palette looks like. But I remember being in Florida at the time that like the teaser pictures, either the teaser pictures were posted or the launch date, and I like was online ready to order. For a second I was like, wait, is this the Sunrise palette? Anyway, I was so excited about the Zendo palette. And then I got it and I just was not impressed with the quality. One of the, I don't want to say like worst quality, but like of my Natasha Denona palettes, that is one of the like lesser quality palettes in my opinion. There were just some shades in that palette that didn't work for me. And overall, I just wasn't excited about the eyeshadow palette when I actually physically had it in my hands. And since owning that palette, which I believe I purchased that in 2021, I think is when it launched, I've used it 9 times. Okay, I think I've owned this palette since 2020. I think that's when this one launched. This is the Pat McGrath Interstellar Icon Quad. I think this is my last Pat McGrath quad that I own, and I actually really enjoy this quad. And I feel like I say that all the time, but I've only reached for this 9 total times. And I'm like, okay, I swear I've reached for this more than 9 times, but I guess just 9. This is something I definitely want to pull out this fall. Just this color story reads really fall in my opinion, and I feel like this color story, more so even today than in years past, is something that I like really, I look at this and I'm like, okay, this is a really, really pretty color story, all of the shades. So I'm excited to pull this out in the fall and hopefully maybe get 9 uses on it this year so we can double its usage. But as of right now, in the last, I think 5 years, this has gotten 9 uses. I didn't mention in the introduction, but I have been tracking my palette usage since 2020. So basically I am going off of my 2020, like January of 2020 to July of 2024. So we have about 4.5 years of tracked usage to share with you guys. All right, then I've definitely owned this since 2020, and I swear, well, actually, maybe I owned this in 2019 before I started tracking my usage, because I'm like, I swear when I first got this palette, I was using it quite a bit just to like test it out. But in the last 4.5 years, I've only tracked 9 uses with the Melt Smoke Session palette. And that makes me so sad because I also have grown more of an appreciation for greens. Like the longer, like I definitely appreciate green eyeshadow more today than I did in 2020 or 2019 when I first purchased this palette. So this makes me really sad. Like, I definitely need to get some more use out of this one. And then another one from Melt, the Melt Gemini, I've only used 9 times. I also really, really love this color story. I think it's really just grungy and beautiful. And I have created looks with this palette that I really, really love. But I guess I've only reached for this palette 9 total times to create some of the looks that like actually do stick out in my mind. And I think maybe, like, in my mind, I love this palette so much, but I think maybe I love it for the color story, like love it aesthetically, but clearly not getting enough use out of it to show that I like love it in action. So hoping to again get some more use out of this one in the fall time. Even like 5 uses with this I'd be really happy with. But again, I like green eyeshadow more today than I did when I first purchased this palette, so a little bit embarrassed I've only reached for that 9 times. All right, even worse than that, I have 2 eyeshadow palettes that I've only reached for 8 times. I have the Natasha Denona Love eyeshadow palette, which I think came into my collection at the beginning of 2021. Again, mine looks a little bit different because I have my palettes kind of mixed and matched right now. But I remember, again, I can post a picture of the original color story over to the side here. I remember when this launched, I like really wanted it, but I felt like it was, like I wasn't like as into Natasha Denona at that time. I was still at that time thinking like, okay, $65, which they're $69 now. $65 is like a lot for an eyeshadow palette, which don't get me wrong, I still am like, okay, $65 for an eyeshadow palette, like it's expensive. But I remember not purchasing it, and then Samantha March had included it in like her top palettes of that year. And then after even that year, I kept hearing people talk about this eyeshadow palette, and so eventually I did purchase it. And I will say, just in practice, the color story, it just isn't like a color story that I find myself excited to reach for all that often. I know I have purples on my eyes today, but if I'm reaching for like a purple or a pink, it's usually more of like a dusty purple or a dusty pink situation. And I just felt a little bit confused by the color story, or just didn't know exactly what to do with the color story. So that palette I've only reached for 8 times since owning it. And then also, I'm really sad to say, the Huda Wild Tiger palette I've also only reached for 8 total times. Sorry, yeah, 8 total times, which I'm like, I could swear. Actually, I think this is a 9, because I know I've reached for this at least once this year and I forgot to include that. But still, 9 uses. Like, I swear I've reached for this so many more times. I remember when these first launched, like, I was reaching for this palette what felt like quite a bit. I wore this to the state fair one year. Maybe, I think what happens sometimes is like, I'll do a look with a palette that I really love, and like I can remember that look and that event maybe that I went to. There's another palette coming up that I kind of have the same situation with, and I think in my mind then I love the palette so much because maybe I had a really good time at that event, and I remember the eyeshadow palette that I was wearing for that event, so I just have like good memories tied to like a look that I created with a palette. And so then in my mind I'm like, oh my gosh, I love this palette so much. But yeah, I feel like I'm like calling myself out here, but I talk about how much I love this palette, but I've only reached for it 8 times. All right, I have 3 eyeshadow palettes that I've only reached for 7 times, and you guys, one of them is my Sassy Siennas palette, and I have owned this 2017. I feel like maybe I purchased this, so that would be 2017, 2018, 19, 20, 20, 8 years. I haven't even used this an average of 1 time a year that I've owned this. Now, this is a palette that I did include in the products that will self-destruct, and I told myself I need to use this either 20 or 25 times this year, or I need to declutter it at the end of the year. And still looking at this, like, the color story makes me so happy, and like I've really been into a warm brown, so I really should reach for this, especially as we're still in August. I still haven't reached for this even this year, and I've only reached for this 7 times in its life with me. All right, and then I have 2 Pat McGrath palettes I've only reached for 7 times, which, considering how much a Pat McGrath palette is, like, we should be getting more than 7 uses out of it. It costs more, like it's cost me more than $10 per use at this point in time. Almost, I guess closer to like $15 or $16. Just to, like, per use, if you like start to do the math. I hope that's right. Anyway, I have this one, which I don't know which one this is. I think this is Pat McGrath number 3. That's how I refer to it as. I could be wrong on that. I will say I did use this 1 or 2 times at the beginning of this year, and I really loved the looks that I created with this. I think this quad of shades is really, really beautiful, and I really do want to get more use out of my Pat McGrath palettes. Perhaps I should do like really try and no pan left behind every pat palette in my collection, especially since they're so expensive. But I've only used that seven times. And then same with the Pat McGrath Divine Rose eyeshadow palette. And I will say I decluttered this palette and then recluttered it, and I still just don't feel super inspired by this palette. I just think this palette looks really boring, and I've never created a look with this palette that I'm like, oh my gosh, this is the most earth-shattering look I've ever created, especially considering how much more into indie I am now than at the time even that I purchased this. But even like this special shade, like the special quad of shades, I'm like not inspired by this one. All right, then I have 3 eyeshadow palettes I've only reached for 6 times. And this is the eyeshadow palette that I am like calling myself out for, because I created a look with this palette. And I went to, it was like this pumpkin patch wine thing with my friends, I think in 2021. It was right before all of the chaos ensued with me getting separated and eventually divorced. And I remember just like having such a fond memory of that day and absolutely loving this eyeshadow palette because I have such a fond memory of that day and like spending that day with friends I hadn't seen in such a long time. And ever since then, I'm like, oh my gosh, I love this eyeshadow palette so much, but I've literally only reached for this 6 times since owning it in 2021. So that is really pathetic. I definitely need to reach for this more. Maybe I should pull this out for another pumpkin patch fall festivity this year. But this is a really versatile palette, and there are like, I can do like a brown look, I could do like a mauve look, I could do like a warmer pink look, and then I have like this fun bluish shimmer. I have this really fun like shimmery shifty shade up here. So there's a lot of things that I can do with this palette. I can create like work appropriate looks with this palette too, so there's really no excuse for me to not be reaching for this. And this is definitely one I want to pull out to no pan left behind this year, because I'm embarrassed that I've only reached for that 6 times. Then I have my ColourPop Cabana Club palette, which I really like, and I swear I've reached for this more than 6 times, but I only have 6 tracked uses. And this is definitely something that I think I use this a lot when and by a lot I mean 6 times clearly, when I first purchased it, or just, you know, 3-4 times when I first purchased it, was really enjoying it, probably have fond summer memories with it. And then like I feel like I love the shimmer shades specifically in this palette, and I like that we have a yellow. So in my mind I like this palette so much, but I've also in practice only used it 6 times. And then also I have my Glamlite Cake palette, which is something that I'm currently working on in my No Pan Left Behind. And I do love having this eyeshadow palette in my collection because I essentially have a rainbow palette, a good quality rainbow palette, and I really like the palette for that purpose, but I've only reached for it 6 times total in its lifetime with me. So that's embarrassing. All right, next up I have my Amartine, my Aether Beauty Amartine Crystal Quad, which I've reached for 5 total times. I actually really love this quad, but I will say I think I brought this into my collection at a time where I thought I was really loving Dusty Mauves, but then like I quickly like didn't stop loving them, but like I feel like I had my like mauve toned era and then like fell out of that and just haven't fell back into that. Like I had a mauve toned era, but whenever I do create looks with this palette, they're pretty much all the same, but I do really like the looks that I create with this palette. I love having this little quad in my collection, but yeah, I guess I've only created the same 5 looks with this 5 total times, or the same look with this 5 total times. Okay, and then the last 2 palettes, and I will say I did get these I think right at in the fall of 2021, right before chaos ensued in my life, so maybe that makes somewhat of sense. But I have the Huda Beauty Wild Jaguar palette, which I've only reached for 4 times in its lifetime with me. 4 times. I swear. And this is where I'm like, it could be like the time period of life, like maybe it's like I missed some tracked uses, but probably not that much. This is definitely a neglected palette in my collection. I do think this would make a really beautiful companion palette to the Huda Beauty Grunge palette, which she launched last year. And I will say I'm definitely more inspired by cool tones towards like in the winter time. So I need to pull this out this winter and get some uses on that. And then even more embarrassing than that is the Huda Wild Python palette. This is the most neglected palette that is currently in my collection, and I have reached for, well, I will say, I didn't want to do palettes, basically 2022 and like 2022, 2023, and 2024. I didn't want to include any palettes that I had like gotten in those years, just because I'm like, okay, I've owned them for less time. I thought it would be more fun to track palettes that I've obviously owned for longer and therefore had more opportunity to use these eyeshadow palettes. But this, I think I must have gotten this in, again, I think 2021. And I've only reached this 3 times, which was probably the 3 times I used this to test this palette out. Now I will say I'm definitely more into a blue, so I feel like I would really like I'm like, again, like looking at this, although that's like kind of, but I feel like that would even be like a work appropriate blue. Like this shade up here, I'm like, this is like right up my alley. It's like a green gold, which I love, especially for like neutral work appropriate looks that I want to add just like a pop. Like in theory, I should be getting a lot more use out of this, especially because this also has 2 like very easy to use brown shadows, and I love like a neon. I love this chartreusey shade, so I would love to get some use out of this in August actually, because I feel like that would be like the perfect time to reach for this palette. Only reached for this 3 times total in its life with me. Anyway, you guys, those are the 15 most neglected eyeshadow palettes that are currently in my palette collection. I would love to know in the comments below, what is your most neglected eyeshadow palette? Let a girl know. Other than that, thank you so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting me and my channel as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I will catch you in my next video. Bye.